Chapter 12, Act 12, The Twin's Tale. Act 12, The Twin's Tale, The Diverging Path. 17 years prior. Mysidia.
Well then, let us begin today's lesson.
Porum nodded obediently, trying not to give away just how giddy she was that morning.
All right.
She was so happy that she could hardly keep still. Finally, they were going to start talking about level 3 magic, and the elder had even gathered some of his more advanced students for live demonstrations. It was shaping up to be an exciting day already, and the novelty of slipping back into her daily routine after miraculously returning from the war alive and well still had not worn off, either. If anyone had asked Porum in that moment what she wanted to change about her life, she would have beamed happily and declared,
"Nothing. It's perfect."
The elder paused for a moment, just now realizing that he had only been addressing Porum. He glanced to his left, where 3 black mages were waiting patiently, hands tucked into their billowing robes, and then to his right, where 3 white mages were looking at each other with apprehension. Finally, the elder sighed and pressed his fingers to his forehead.
"Where is Porum?"
"Well, almost perfect." Porum looked at their surroundings. Palem's bed was empty, but not made, typical, and all of his stuff was still piled next to it, so he couldn't have gone anywhere far. She knew he wasn't in the bath, because it was the ladies of the tower's morning to use it. Suddenly, it hit her.
"Oh, not again,"
she grumbled.
"I'll find him."
She walked outside the tower and around the corner to where a little man-made pond was dug for rainwater. Sure enough, her twin brother was outside, regaling a random cute girl who was visiting Mysidia for a field trip from Troya. This was a habit he had started picking up since things in the world had settled down a bit and people started traveling again. That meant lots of new faces were visiting Mysidia, which had become even more infamous since the Red Wings water crystal burglary. This particular face had honey blonde hair pulled up into 2 pigtails, wearing an elegant green taffeta dress that was beautifully cut and brought out the green undertones of her haunting grey eyes. Porum had his chest puffed out as he was talking.
"So I cast a mighty blizzard on the fires of Mount Ordeals."
Porum marched right up to him, smacking him on the head. Porum screeched and tried to bat her away, but she blocked his fists and hit him again. The little girl watched wide-eyed, trying to stifle her laughter.
"When are you going to stop that? The elder's furious with you."
Porum shrieked. She grabbed Palem's collar, and started to drag him away. Porum looked back toward the girl longingly, reaching out with his hand.
"But it is Leonora's last day here." "Oh geez,"
Porum whispered.
"You won't even remember her in a week. And we've got other places to be today, remember? After our lesson this morning, we must make way for Baron. The wedding will start with or without us, and I, for one, want to actually see it."
When Porum shoved her brother back inside the Tower of Prayer, the elder immediately jumped on him, his eyes red with rage.
"How many times must I tell you the same thing before it sinks into that thick skull of yours? You've a great deal of growing up to do if you ever plan to be the sort of mage Tella was. 2 more hours of spell transcription for you."
Palem's jaw dropped. The elder's words had landed a critical hit, invoking Tella's legacy and boring homework. The elder couldn't be serious, right?
Not again."
Porum crossed her arms over her chest and smirked.
"You've only yourself to blame, you know."
Porum glared down at his leather boots, his fists clenched. Porum's incessant mocking was the straw that broke the camel's back. "Forget this. I've had enough of this stupid training. Spell transcription is just busy work for novices." Without another word, he spun on his heel and bolted back through the door Porum had just dragged him through, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind him with a jarring crash that made everyone in the classroom jump. Porum gasped, raising her hand in protest even though he was already long gone.
"Porum."
The elder shook his head in disgust.
"What a troublesome one."
Porum whirled around, clasping her hands together and preparing to fall to her knees to beg if necessary. If they didn't get to do any of the training they had planned for the morning, who knew when they would get to it again? The elder had made it very clear that the students who were joining them for the lesson were extremely busy and that such a favor would not have normally been considered, had it not been the twin geniuses of Mysidia who were the pupils.
"Please allow me to go after him, elder."
The elder sighed.
"You may have experience in battle, yes, but you are both still young. More spiritual training is still required to master the magic you seek. Do you really think you can get that through to him?" I will, Elder.
Porum nodded solemnly. I have to drag him back here before the elder gets any angrier. One of the black mages rolled his eyes.
I've never seen anyone hate his training with such passion, much less the best black mage in all Mysidia.
The mage next to him nodded.
I still have trouble believing that he's your twin brother, to be honest, Lady Porum. I sure don't envy you. Such a shame. I had hoped that some of Cecil's humble gallantry would rub off on Pollum during their travels.
A white mage shook her head.
Pollum is a world traveler now. Perhaps Mysidia is starting to feel a tad cramped for him.
Another white mage said tenderly. Porum bit her lip and turned to leave, feeling the unbearable flush of embarrassment crawl up her cheeks. Even though she hadn't done anything wrong, she couldn't help but feel like every time Pollum caused a scene or threw a fit about something that she was instantly guilty by association. And no matter what, she was always the one who had to fix it. It was she who was expected to walk behind him at all times, cleaning up his messes before they inconvenienced someone else. Porum wandered back outside the Tower of Prayer, sneaking into the bushes that bordered the gardens and peering over the ledge to spy on the pond she had caught Pollum near in the middle of his brag fest. Sure enough, he had returned to the scene of the crime, although the little girl he had been talking to had fled. Smart of her, Porum thought bitterly, crawling back out of the bushes and yanking the twigs out of her hair. She marched behind Pollum, tempted to smack him in the face but instead tapping him, with a smidge of aggression, on his shoulder.
Give it up, Pollum. The elder wants to see you.
Pollum turned around, making a rude gesture with his finger.
Tough for him. I'm not gonna start my training all over again with transcription. No way.
Porum frowned.
You're better than this, Pollum. I thought you wanted to be a great sage, like Tella.
Pollum shook his head.
Tella probably never had to put up with an obnoxious teacher who was out to get him at every turn.
Porum looked down.
Pollum. I know you're angry, but the elder is more than our teacher. He's our mom and our dad. He rescued us when we were left for dead in Barren. Do you think anyone else on the entire planet would have summoned the power he had to call upon to save us from our petrification?
Pollum pressed his lips into a straight line.
Humph. Fine. You're right, you win.
Porum smiled a little, offering her hand. But Pollum brushed past her, marching back up to the Tower of Prayer by himself. She lowered her hand slowly, watching his disappearing form. You're such a fool. It's not about me winning. Porum climbed up the hill after him, silently slipping back through the tower entrance. She was dismayed to find that the 6 mages whom had arrived for training had disappeared, leaving the elder and Pollum in the middle of a heated conversation. Porum was about to back away, but the elder caught her gaze and discreetly motioned her over with a curl of his finger.
You look like you have something on your mind, boy. Why don't you just come out and say it?
Pollum threw his hands in the air.
Look, elder, you may not be aware of this, but my skills have developed much more than you think.
Porum's jaw dropped to the floor.
Pollum.
The elder crossed his arms over his chest.
Is that so? There's nothing else here for you to learn. Is that what you are trying to say?
Pollum looked back at Porum, who was still standing in the doorway, shocked at the audacity of what was coming out of her brother's mouth.
Come on, elder. You know just as well as I do how powerful we really are.
Porum shook her head, her voice cracking as she avoided his piercing gaze.
Hold your tongue, Pollum.
Pollum smirked.
You think so, too, right Porum? Without us, Cecil would have never made it anywhere near Mount Ordeals.
Porum looked away, her heart racing. Maybe that was a little true. But they had first met Cecil under the most dreadful of circumstances. He had just been shipwrecked and lost all of his companions, Rosa had been captured by Golbez, and his soul was so shredded by pain and regret from training under the dark sword that Porum had feared he was on the brink of death when she first laid eyes upon him. Yes, the elder had originally sent Pollum and Porum to spy on him, but in the end, everything Cecil had achieved on Mount Ordeals was his own doing. Porum wondered how Pollum could possibly cite Cecil's weaknesses and vulnerability as an example of his own strength. He's deplorable, Porum thought to herself angrily. Don't you dare look at me while you say such terrible things about our friends. Interpreting Porum's lack of reply as an affirmation for his words, Pollum turned back to the elder, satisfied.
We've grown so much since the journey we took. Haven't you realized that, elder?
The elder twisted his mouth in thought.
I suppose you have a point.
What? Porum silently screamed. You're kidding. Palm puffed out his chest.
I know I do. 'Cause I'm gonna become a sage. Just like old man Tella.
The elder sneered.
Tella, you say? Then you have a long way to go, Palm. Growth is not something gained on your own. It is the product of all the people you meet along the way. From Cecil and Tella to everyone else around you.
Palm flushed, feeling a twinge of regret for badmouthing Cecil.
I already know that, elder. I don't need you to tell me. It is a simple thing to say, but I forbid you from leaving my city. It is still too soon for you.
Palm pouted.
Too soon? Well, when's it not gonna be too soon?
The elder sighed, exasperated.
When you have truly understood the words I have spoken. Can I go out and travel the world once I do? Once you do? Yes.
Palem's grin returned, lighting up his features.
All righty-ite. I'll be outta here in a flash. Cecil and the others better be ready for me.
He flicked his braid over his shoulder, and smirked.
I guess that's all the time we have for today if we want to make it to Baron in time, right? I'll be making myself respectable.
With that, he pushed past the elder and ran upstairs to what Porum could only assume was the washroom. After his pounding footsteps had faded, Porum walked up to the elder, confusion alit in her eyes.
Are you sure you meant to tell him that, elder?
Porum asked meekly. She never wanted to give the elder the impression she was questioning him, but she had wondered if their talk had had the opposite effect on Palm than it should have. Instead of being humbled, Palm was now more convinced by his abilities than ever. The elder nodded.
Of course. The meetings and partings one experiences in life help to strengthen the self. As hard as it is to believe, I do think your brother will one day be ready to leave my city. You both demonstrated a great sense of responsibility when you sacrificed yourselves for Cecil and the others. But one such act is not enough, he needs to demonstrate accountability here at home, too, when the stakes are not so high. I think once a little more time has passed and life truly returns back to normal for us again, he will be more understanding of what I am asking of him.
Porum nodded.
Yes, elder.
She didn't exactly agree with everything he said, but she respected the wisdom behind it. The elder had been around for a long time, after all, he had taught many pupils, met many different kinds of people, and had been around the world several times over himself. He had seen a lot change in the time he had been on the planet, and had more perspective than Porum knew she could ever hope for. The elder tilted his head.
And I'm sure you would like to hit the road yourself someday, Porum.
Porum blinked.
What?
He smiled kindly.
It is written on your face, plain as day.
Porum pressed her lips together, feeling a tremble run through her body.
Oh.
My city, one day after the moon's return. Porum folded the elegantly inscribed wedding invitation back into thirds, taking care not to bend the corners as she smoothly slid it back into its ivory envelope. Pressing the flap down, she could still make out the baronian coat of arms that was impressed upon the crimson wax seal, a pair of griffins flanking a slender blade and a replicate of the crown of the royal family. The invitation had been hand-delivered to the elder nearly 17 years ago by a member of Baron's royal guard, containing the announcement of Cecil's coronation as King of Baron and subsequent marriage to Rosa, who would become his queen. Porum had been so excited about the wedding that she begged the elder to let her keep the invitation as a keepsake for her diary, a new hobby she had taken up after returning home from the war. She had seen so many wonderful things in her short time with Cecil that she had decided she would start documenting them right away, before she forgot any of the little details of her journey. After she had completed chronicling her adventures, she brought her diary to Cecil's wedding, and spent the entire evening while the grown-ups drank and danced writing about everything she had seen and heard until she passed out, face down in the open notebook at the children's table, her cheeks smudged with the yet fresh ink. Tucking the invitation back inside the first leather-bound volume she had filled up with her daily observations, frustrations with her brother and all of the secrets she couldn't bring herself to share with anyone else, Porum flipped several pages ahead to where yet another letter was tucked away. This one had been delivered by Damsyon, and still carried the sweet scent of the lily of the valley that had accompanied it. Porum had carefully laid the flower against the silky paper Edward had hand-scribed himself with all of their names and the date and time of the grand celebration for Damsyon Castle's reconstruction. What had started out as a day full of scrumptious food and visiting with long unseen friends had become a race against time when Palom and Porum had volunteered to help Cecil and Sid stay the monsters that were escaping en masse from the sealed cave. This was the first time the Elder let us travel on our own after the war ended, Porum thought, flipping through a few pages of her rushed handwriting. And it was the first time that both Palom and I had ever been tricked by the disguise of an enemy. We never figured out who, or what, that girl was that was pretending to be Rydia. Perhaps she wasn't a monster, and that was why we could not detect her presence. But I guess we'll never know now. Porum sighed aloud as she flipped to the last few pages of the journal. She had been thinking about the past a lot, more so ever since Theodore had stumbled onto her doorstep last night. Seeing Theodore again after so long had reminded Porum of when she had met Cecil, and the need to wallow in nostalgia after such a trying past few weeks had overcome her, causing her to turn to her old diaries. With Palom gone and the Elder sick, there was very little for her to occupy her time with when she was not minding the Tower of Prayer in the Elder's place. Escorting Cecil to Mount Ordeals had been the first time Porum and Palom had ever been allowed to leave the village, and they had done it together, surviving against all odds. There had never been a day in Porum's childhood that she had not been by her brother's side, but when she was younger, she hadn't much minded that. She and Palom didn't always get along, but they were friends more often than they were not. But things had begun to slowly change between them as the years wore on, for the worse. Porum wasn't sure if it was the war that had spurned the changes in their relationship, or if it was just a natural consequence of growing up, but steadily, she and her twin brother had begun to drift apart. Her eyes fell upon the page she had landed on, dated a couple of years after they had defeated Rydia's impostor in the underworld. This was the last journey we took together where things were normal between Palom and I, Porum thought, her eyes watering as she began to read through the final pages of the journal. And after that. Dear Diary. It's the last day of sailing before we reach Capo. Palom has mostly slept this whole time, and to be honest, there hasn't been much to see, just endless ocean since we've left Mysidia. At first, being on the ship made me sick. It's amazing how I can fly on an airship with no problems, but put a ship on the sea and I turn as green as a Sahajan. But I've found that if I can concentrate very hard on one thing, like this journal, I don't think about my stomach tossing about as much. I still can't believe the day is finally here that Palom and I are able to travel on our own. Of course, Palom being who he is, ultimately got to pick where we went. But I was just happy he invited me to come along, although I think the Elder would have made him take me anyway.
Haha. Finally. I'm off on my quest to become a sage.
Palom had bounded upstairs from the hold of the ship, fresh off of another one of his naps. Porum, who had been staring over the railing of the ship, watching as the shores of Capo inched closer and closer, turned to look at her brother. They were still mirror images of each other, shoulder-length chestnut brown hair swept away from their faces, wide, sparkling brown eyes that reflected the glittering sea that surrounded them, and matching sets of crescent moon-shaped lips that were the same dusty pink as carnations. Neither had yet hit the initial growth spurt that always seemed to precede adolescence, so they were both still similar heights, their healthily tanned faces still flush with baby fat.
What made you want to visit Capo first?
Porum smiled. Palom crossed his arms over his chest.
'Cause it's Tella's homeland, of course. What did you think?
Porum tilted her head.
That's all.
Palom huffed, his lips starting to twist into a scowl.
What do you mean, that's all?
She shook her head, letting out a slight sigh.
Don't you understand anything? Hey. The title of sage isn't something to be obtained. It's something that's granted to you.
Palom flushed, the same way he always did when he was getting ready to feed someone a line. Porum had picked up on that tell long ago.
Why yeah, that's right. I knew that already.
Porum pressed the palms of her hands together, willing them to not reach out and smack her idiot brother in the head.
Then, who do you think grants something like that to you? The Elder, right?
Porum frowned.
No. The people of the world do.
This revelation clearly shook Palom, who stumbled back a few feet even though the ship had hardly rocked. They had been lucky and were traversing fantastically clear seas that morning, for which Porum's stomach was especially grateful.
What?
Porum would have burst out laughing if she wasn't on the brink of tears. Her brother's idiocy was beyond words. Had he really learned nothing from the elder after all of these years?
Nobody's going to call you a sage just because you've learned black and white magic. You have to throw away your own wishes and ambitions, Porum, and learn to use your magic to benefit the whole world. Not just yourself.
Porum flicked his wrist dismissively, sticking out his tongue. Pfft.
That goes without saying, Porum. Are you sure you know? Well, that's the way Tella was, wasn't it?
Porum nodded. She had to give credit where credit was due. Her twin at least had a good understanding of his hero's approach to life when he had been among the living.
You're right. Tella traveled around the world with the elder himself, long ago. Just like we're doing right now.
He grinned, all traces of the stormy scowl that had been starting to take over blowing away with the sea breeze that washed over them.
Wow. Really? I knew it.
Encouraged, Porum went on.
Eventually, the elder returned to Mysidia and devoted his life to protecting the world through his magic. Tella, meanwhile, continued his travels for years afterward, using his power for the good of all mankind. How long did he do that for?
Porum blinked.
Oh, at least decades.
Porum went pale. Oof. That long? Porum's lips couldn't help but twitch into the tiniest of smiles at the sudden turn in her brother's pallor.
And at the end of his journey, he decided to settle down in Capo, where Anna was born.
Porum looked away pensively, his eyebrows knitted.
Hey. I didn't know that.
She shrugged.
Of course, it'll probably take longer for you than it did for him.
Porum shook his head.
Well. I'll give it a shot. I'm in this for the long haul.
After we docked in Capo, we made the long journey across the desert to reach Capo proper. Capo is built around a little oasis in the middle of the huge Damsayan desert, and the desert itself is filled with gross monsters like sandworms and hind legs. If you're not careful to drink lots of water, you can contract desert fever. It sounds frightful, but you can survive if you are cured with a sand pearl before the fever has run its course. However, I don't know if I could trust Porum with such an arduous task. I may as well consider myself dead at that point. When we made it to the village, I was so surprised to see just how different it was from Mysidia. There are outdoor shops and stands everywhere, swathed in a mixture of beautiful jewel-toned fabrics and less flashy and positively ancient canvas swatches that have been so ravaged by the sun and wind that they are practically transparent. Palm trees that are as tall as 10 men are scattered about, the biggest ones providing so much shade that you see large groups of people gathered under them to eat or talk. Capo is built right next to the only source of water in the whole desert, and canals have been dug everywhere to bring that water directly into the city so that no one has to leave the city walls to get a drink. As you walk the cobblestone streets, sand crunches under your boots, and if you are not careful, a big gust of wind will carry more sand right into your eyes, even with the massive ivory walls that protect the city. Porum says all he wants to do now that we are here is take it easy, but as I've been sitting under one of the palm trees and watching him as I write, I can see his eyes darting around anxiously, like he is looking out for something. I've seen him go up to a few people now and ask them questions, but I can't tell what they are saying, or what they point to in reply. Porum closed her journal, tucking it into her knapsack and leaning back against the palm tree, her eyes sliding shut. She thought it would be agonizingly hot in a place like Capo, but the water that ran through the numerous canals would gift you with a refreshingly cool breeze if it hit you in just the right way. A yawn escaped her lips, and she thought perhaps Porum was right, a moment of rest could very well do them both good.
Porum.
Her eyes snapped open only to find her brother staring at her impatiently. She doubted she could have been asleep for any more than a minute.
Let's go, there's something interesting we should see on the north side of town. Oh.
Porum rubbed her eyes, another yawn forthcoming.
Coming.
She pulled herself up from the ground, brushing the sand off her bottom and her knapsack before slinging it over her shoulders and letting Palom take the lead. They passed through the marketplace, Porum's head whipping in every direction as she tried to take in all of the people and the activity bubbling up around her. Many of the adults would smile and nod at them as they passed through, and she felt very grown up indeed, walking among strangers and not being stopped to ask if she was lost or where her parents were. At last, they broke through the crowds and came to a small pool that was built underneath one of the village's border walls. On the other side of the wall was the oasis, which flowed into the pool and was then distributed to the rest of the city via the canals. A stretch of green ran along the banks, with 2 small gardens filled with hibiscus bushes and orange-scented plumeria that brushed up against a pair of small, but well-cared-for gravestones. Palom walked up to one of the graves, pausing. Porum snuck up behind him, and began to quietly read out loud.
Tella, the great sage, rests in this desert oasis together with his beloved daughter Anna. This is really it. The old man's grave.
Palom whispered. Porum pressed her lips together.
Well, don't just stand there. Offer your respects to him.
She bowed her head, folding her hands together and closing her eyes. Palom followed suit, clenching his eyes shut and for once, trying to look serious. Porum could feel her heart getting heavier as she thought back to when they had first met Tella. Even though the elder and Tella had been friends all their lives, the twins had only encountered him for the first time on Mount Ordeals with Cecil. Shockingly, Tella and Cecil had known each other as well, and Tella had offered to join forces with them to conquer the rest of the mountain. It had been during that encounter that Porum had realized that if someone as world-renowned and kind as Tella was friends with someone like Cecil, that perhaps the Dark Knight stood a chance of surviving Mount Ordeal's trial after all. There had to be some mote of light within the lost knight that had drawn Tella to him. Unfortunately, it was only after Tella's death that Porum had learned the truth, that even in the beloved sage, there had been a stain of darkness, one that had slowly spread through his heart and gnawed at him until his bitter end, when he had died attempting to exact revenge against Golbez for murdering Anna by unleashing upon him the ultimate black magic, Meteor. The spell's power had been too much for the old man's weakened body and spirit, and he traded all of his life force for what had ultimately been a failed attempt to slay Golbez. The elder had broken the news to Palom and Porum shortly after they had returned home to Mysidia, when they questioned why Tella had not joined them in the Tower of Prayers to pray for Cecil and the others while they were fighting for their lives on the moon.
No matter how good and filled with light a man's heart may be, there is always a touch of darkness, the elder had explained to the teary twins. Even our most beloved heroes must constantly wage battle against the threat of darkness and could be consumed at any time if they turn their backs to the light. And the reverse is true as well, there is always a trace of light in the darkest of hearts, let that bolster your faith when you feel lost or afraid. Let Tella's legacy inspire you and let his kind self always be how you remember him. But do not forget how he met his end. Never forget that things could have been different.
Porum could feel the sweat starting to trickle down her neck from the intense desert sun beating down on her back. Tella. May you be happy together with Anna for all eternity. And may you guide us with your infinite wisdom. She opened one eye slightly to spy on Palom, who still had his eyes closed. Especially Palom, he really needs it. Palom's forehead was scrunched up in thought. He realized that after his sister barked her orders at him that he didn't exactly know what to say when you were talking to a dead person. He had never been to a funeral before, and this was his first visit to a grave of someone he had known when they were alive. When Baron had invaded Mysidia all those years ago and had stolen the Crystal of Water, Palom had not actually known any of the mages that had fallen in the brutal bloodshed that had followed. He remembered the elder saying that he and Porum were too young to attend the mass funeral ceremony they had held on the shore, where the cremated remains of those slain had been released during the evening tide. Porum had spent the night crying in the Tower of Prayers, and Palom, not knowing how to possibly comfort her, had just sat by her side, staring at his feet. Maybe just try talking to him like he was still here? Palom thought, swallowing the lump in his throat. Hey, old man. Guess it's been a while, hasn't it? Well, I'm finally here. I came to visit your homeland and everything. I hope you're watching over me, Tella. Because someday I'm gonna be a sage, just like you. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Porum staring at him with a kind, but sad smile.
Palom, is this why you wanted to come to Capo?
Palom blushed a little, raising his hand.
Haha. Just thought I'd check up on the old man first, you know.
First? Porum wondered, but found herself distracted by the grave that was next to Telea's, realizing that she had yet to read it as well. Turning away from Palom, she cleared her throat, which had started to get a little dry from the sand drifting through the air, and read out loud once more for both their benefit.
Anna, daughter of the great and gentle sage, rests in this desert oasis surrounded by eternal love.
Porum pressed her hand to her chest.
I didn't realize Anna was right here as well. You knew who she was, right?
Palom nodded, already lost in thought. Anna, the woman King Edward loved with all his heart. She must be even a nice lady. Maybe kind of like our mom. I guess I can't really remember her anymore. Porum lowered her eyes. Anna, I witnessed in person through Edward's stories about you the grace and profound love you possessed within. May you rest in peace alongside Tella for all time. She thought about the dreamy light that would shine in Edward's eyes whenever Anna came up, and how he would suddenly start acting like an entirely different person, much more cheerful and hopeful, and let out a quiet sigh. Sometimes I wonder if I too have a chance. A chance to become a woman like you, a woman who knew how to love more deeply than anyone else. Sometimes it feels very hard to love someone, even when you know you should. Why is that? Does that mean I don't know how to love unconditionally, or? She looked over at Palom again, and this time, he was the one staring at her. Her cheeks erupted in a flaming blush. He couldn't read her mind? Right?
What?
Palom shrugged.
Nothing. Shall we go on to training, then? Training?
Porum blinked.
So, that's why we came all the way out here? Where would we possibly train? It is endless desert, and the way to Mist is blocked now. The underground waterway up north.
Palom exclaimed.
Tella used to cross it all the time to go back and forth between Damcyan, you know. He told me some stories. What stories?
Porum raised her eyebrows.
Nothing too dangerous, I hope. Obviously not if he was still going even in his declined state,
Palom frowned.
You saw how much magic he had forgotten by the time we met him on Mount Ordeals. Surely we'll have no issues, it's just some light training against monsters we normally wouldn't ever get to see. How are we going to practice elemancy if we just fight the same foes all the time in the meadows near our village? Monsters in caverns have totally different weaknesses. There might even be some undead that you can practice your white magic on.
Porum shook her head. Unfortunately, her brother had a good point, and she couldn't find any reason to argue. She supposed that their travels couldn't only take them to new towns to people watch within and leisurely explore. Their magic would do neither of them any good if they couldn't continue to apply it to real-life combat situations, where they had to think on their feet and not just solve a problem from a textbook.
Ah, okay,
Porum gave in.
Let's just make sure we have plenty of supplies before we head out, alright?
This place is so creepy. I think it's even worse than Mount Ordeals, if that is possible. But Palom is absolutely enthralled. We've reached a small cavern that must be a popular rest area for passers-by. The floor of the cavern is decorated with pale blue, glowing crystals that are supposed to repel monsters. There were even the remains of a campfire, although the gods only know how long it has been since someone was last here. With the new port that opened in Capo, I'm sure many people do not travel through the cavern anymore to reach the oasis, unless they absolutely have to. Palom lit us a fire and is now cooking lunch. I hope it's somewhat edible, because I am starving. The entire waterway is, as one would expect, very damp and cold. The chill bit into me nearly as soon as I stepped through the mouth of the entryway, and the puddles on the ground have already soaked my boots. We've been descending quite a bit, but according to the map Palom procured while we were shopping in Capo, we should be climbing up again soon. I'm not sure how far he intends to go. If we keep up this pace, we'll be in Damcyan. But at least King Edward would have warm beds we could crawl into, and Harley, his secretary, would make sure we had everything we could possibly want. She's always so organized and everything runs in Damcyan according to her word. She's practically a queen, herself. As we made our way through the waterway, Palom would not stop talking and would just randomly stop and stare, as if he were trying to memorize everything around him. As we were crossing a large bridge, Palom paused again, totally distracted, and I had to bash in the head of a gigantoad that was eyeing him from under the bridge, ready to snatch at his foot and drag him under with its long, disgusting tongue. Yuck.
This must be the place. The bridge where Tella and Cecil first met.
Palom exclaimed, turning to me as I was busy trying to fling toad slime off of my mithril staff. I glared up at him for not even noticing the trouble I had just saved him from.
I'm really walking down this path, aren't I?
Palom asked me eagerly.
I'm gonna be a sage if I keep this up.
Oh, if only you had any idea what you were actually talking about. I yelled at him to stop thinking about superfluous things like that in the middle of what was supposed to be training, but he just skipped ahead, oblivious. To be honest, I've never seen him so engaged in his life, at least not since we last traveled to the underworld and survived the mysterious girl's attack. I am starting to better understand why he longs to be free from Mysidia, but I still can't totally comprehend it. There is still so much both of us have yet to learn, and I'm not ready to leave everyone I know and love. Being with Palom and the Elder make me feel safe. How can be two people who are as alike as we are in every conceivable way be wired so differently? I wonder what Cecil would say if I asked him a question like that. I'm sure he has had the same thoughts about his brother as well. Palom wiped the sweat from her forehead with her sleeve before it could drip into her eyes. Despite how cold the waterway was, the humidity from the moisture all around them was insufferable, and she was exhausted from the steadily upward climb they had begun ever since leaving the campsite. But when she moved her arm back down, she saw sunlight shining brightly ahead of them, beckoning them back to the surface.
We're at the exit already.
Palom unfolded the map, pausing for a moment before shaking his head.
Not just yet.
He closed it back up again, and turned to Palom, who nearly smacked into him.
What?
Palom gasped, and Palom held up his finger.
Can't you feel it? The presence of a monster nearby. A big one.
Palom crossed her arms over her chest, closing her eyes. At first, all she could feel was the ever-increasing chill of the cavern, which had now not only soaked her boots, but had made its way up her pant legs and had started to weigh down her cape. But as she attempted to block out the steady weeping of the cavern ceilings upon the stone floor, and the distant roar of the petite waterfalls they had crossed over on mildew-eaten wooden footbridges, she could feel a heavy, menacing presence that made her stomach twist in knots, almost as if someone had thrown a blanket that had been submerged in warm, stinking juice from rotting produce over her head. She gagged as the scent hit her nose, and her eyes snapped open.
Oh. Yes, now that you mention it.
Palom nodded.
Things are about to get serious. I bet it's in the next stretch of tunnels.
Palom frowned. Another stretch of tunnels. That didn't sound good.
We had better get some rest once we're back above ground. You've got that right.
Once they surfaced, they allowed themselves another break, stripping off their soaked clothes and shoes and setting them out to dry in the sun as they ate another round of mana-replenishing snacks in their underclothes, a tunic and bloomers for Palom, and a sleeveless shirt and shorts for Palom. Now the overbearing afternoon sun felt amazing, and Palom could already feel her spirits perking up. Whatever the monster was that was waiting for them had to have been troublesome for the locals. She would be happy to put it in its place, once she was a little warmer and no longer felt like she was about to catch her death.
You know, once more kingdoms have airships, people aren't going to go into places like this anymore,
Palom said, and Palom looked up at him, swallowing the food she was in the middle of chewing.
You think other kingdoms will have airships someday? Well, sure,
Palom blinked.
Why wouldn't they? Cecil gave the falcon to the dwarves, and it's just going to be a matter of time before other kingdoms want in on the action too, don't you think? The world has already changed so much since the war ended, people are trying to find easier ways to cross borders and become global citizens. Now that everyone has seen the power of Baron thanks to all the hell they caused during the war, they're going to want to replicate it so they can advance even further too. At least, that's what I would want, if I were king. I'd be afraid of Baron pulling another fast one.
Palom tilted her head. The thought of Palom as a king of anything gave her nightmares. She could barely picture him even becoming elder of their little village.
I don't know about that. I think most of the people in this world that hold any kind of power understand that what happened to Baron was just a series of unfortunate events. Baron was as much of a victim as anyone else. Their ruler was killed and impersonated by the Fiend of Water, Cagnazo, and it was after that that all of their war crimes were committed. It doesn't seem like anyone is rushing to compete with Baron in terms of military or technology. Everyone seems content now that Cecil is on the throne. It may not be in a country's best interest to try to do everything Baron does. That is how traditions die that make each land unique, after all. Tradition? What good is it?
Palom smirked.
If people don't change, they'll be left behind. Honestly, Porum, can you think of any good tradition has done for us?
She brought her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs.
I think there is a place in the world for both progress and tradition. I can't think of anything specific off the top of my head, but... Well, I can think of something.
Palom frowned.
Maybe if Mysidia hadn't become such a haven for magical families, our parents would have decided it was worth it to raise us.
Porum's eyes widened.
What do you mean by that? You know exactly what I mean. Once the elders settled in Mysidia, it began to attract more and more people blessed with magical powers. The elder had the spiritual temperament to understand that Mysidia sat on holy land, even before anyone knew or understand what role Cecil's Lunarian father had in bringing magic to the blue planet, and everyone else ate it up. Families like ours were seen as not being able to contribute anything to Mysidia, and were isolated until they left on their own or died out. I still think that when we were born, Mom and Dad felt forced to give us up because we had magic. I don't think they did it willingly. Palom.
Porum looked away. She could feel her heart breaking as she struggled with what she wanted to say. She knew she was teetering on the edge of a knife point.
Do you really think the elder would make our parents give us up? He would never allow such behavior to thrive in Mysidia. I won't deny that magic seemingly gave you a higher station in the village, but... he would never tear apart a family. Mom and Dad asked the elder to raise us because they thought he could give us a better life than they. That he could raise us to our full potential, which would allow us to carve out our own destinies. You still think that,
Palom shook his head.
I mean, sure, I believed that when we were kids. It sounded like a cute fairy tale, after all, and it served to give us hope when the time between our parents' visits got longer and longer, before they just stopped altogether. But why would our parents stop coming to see us? The obvious answer is that someone forced them to.
But we are still kids. Porum pushed her fingers through her hair, closing her eyes. No, she couldn't possibly say what she really thought about their parents out loud. Palom would lose it. Instead, she sat quietly in the little clearing until Palom stopped staring at her and returned to eating, grumbling under his breath. Porum reached over, gingerly brushing her hand over the hem of her pants. They were nearly dry. My brother has taken things too far. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt with this trip, but I realize now that was extremely foolish, perhaps even naive, on my part. How can I possibly continue to place my faith and trust in him after what happened today? And worse yet, I think the elder has been foolish, as well, for if he had not given in to Palom's begging, I would not have needed to bear witness to such hubris. I still haven't decided if I should tell him about this, or if I should just let Palom hang himself. One thing is for sure. I won't be cleaning up any messes for him any longer. I am done. Porum gulped as she stared down at the pounding water below their feet, rushing down the falls in a frenzy of white-capped waves and blinding spray. She longingly looked down at her freshly dried boots, which were starting to already glisten with droplets of mist.
Wait. Wait a minute, Palom. That's too dangerous.
Palom pointed down at the lake below.
That monster is at the bottom of this waterfall. If we don't jump, we're never going to be able to reach it to defeat it. I can't see from up here where to aim my magic, there's too much water.
Porum blanched. She really didn't want to jump.
Isn't there any other path?
Palom gestured for her to look around, but she already knew the answer. The entrance to the cavern had taken them directly to a ledge that was above the waterfall, and there were no signs of any pathways that would take them down on either side. Porum could see holes in the ground from where more prepared travelers had driven stakes in order to tie ropes and rappel down, but nothing had been left behind for them to use.
Doesn't look like it. You scared?
Porum could feel the hair on the back of her neck rising.
And no. Of course not.
Porum grinned, taking her hand.
So, let's go.
Before she could protest, he took a flying leap, dragging her alongside him. Porum screamed and closed her eyes, feeling the water pounding over her shoulders and backside as they plunged into the lake below. She felt them crash through the surface of the water, everything around her going into slow motion and the roar of the falls suddenly becoming muted as she dipped underneath the lake. Palem's hand was wrenched from hers as they were pulled under, and she opened her eyes just in time to see Palem's legs kicking as he propelled himself back to the surface. Following suit, Porum raised her arms above her head and began to swim back, throwing her head back and gasping for air as she broke the surface.
Whoa, that felt great.
Palm grinned, and Porum stared at him incredulously, her ponytail completely flattened against the back of her head as she attempted to push her waterlogged bangs out of her eyes. When she could finally see again, she let out a terrified scream. A massive ice blue tentacle lined with quivering suckers was poised above Palem's head, seconds away from striking.
Palm, look out!
Porum shrieked, raising her hand as she desperately kicked her legs to keep herself afloat.
Blink!
Palm whirled around just in time to see the tentacle come within inches of his head before being repelled by Porum's magic, which had swirled around Palm in a flash of golden light just in time to grant him the super agility needed to dodge the hit. Palm fell back effortlessly, and the tentacle smashed down into water, causing such a massive splash with its strength that the twins were soaked all over again. The tentacle's owner emerged from behind the waterfall, a mammoth octopus that carried with it 7 other previously unaccounted for tentacles to join the one that had almost smashed Palem's head in. Its body was made of spongy, mucus-covered blue skin that the rushing waterfall rolled off of effortlessly, and set in the center of its head was a pair of white and red-rimmed eyes that were set too closely together above a set of gleaming teeth. Palm let out a cheer, not even registering that he had already almost bit the dust.
Here goes. My first test on the path to sagehood.
Porum spat out some water that had gotten in her mouth. How could he not be absolutely terrified at what was in front of them?
Don't let your guard down. I know.
Porum tried to reach for her staff, which she had strapped onto her back before they had entered the new cavern that contained the waterfall, but found her hand grasping empty air. It must have fallen off her back when she plunged into the water. Sighing in resignation, she decided the next best thing she could do was find a place she could safely cast magic from. If she wasn't going to be able to defend herself with her staff, she would just be a sitting duck in the water. Turning anxiously to get a sense of her surroundings, Porum could hear the roar of a magic spell that she could only pray had come from her brother and not from the enemy. Spotting a small island a few yards away, she swam over, dragging herself up and rolling onto it, the drenched clothes on her body nearly doubling her weight and greatly decreasing any semblance of agility.
Ugh. Slow.
Porum huffed, beginning a long string of spells to disable the beast as much as possible. She found that, while she could not paralyze the entire beast, she could at least freeze some of his tentacles, giving Palm some leverage to get in closer and give greater range to his magic. She followed up with a series of buffing spells, giving Palm increased speed, agility, and the ability to reflect any magic spells that were cast upon him, of which the beast seemed to favor Blizzara. Porum left herself wide open, focusing her efforts on her brother, and as a result was gifted with several Blizzara spells of her own, the pain so intense thanks to her already saturated clothes that it felt like thousands of ice needles pricking her all over as she was struck. But even with Porum's assistance, Palm seemed to be doing very well on his own, perhaps too well. Porum observed as Palm seemed to immediately know what element to use to utterly devastate the beast. He was slinging Firaga spells, which she found to be an unusual choice for a mage to go with as their gut instinct against both a cavern-dwelling and water-loving monster. Most black mages would have gone with thunder or blizzard, Porum thought as she cast a healing spell through chattering teeth. How would Palm know to go with fire? With one last spell, the octopus let out its death knell, and began to collapse into itself, the mucus bubbling on its overheated flesh as it began to melt into a black pool of sludge that slowly made its way across the lake. Palm spotted Porum and swam over to her, climbing up on the island and watching with satisfaction as the last of the octopus disappeared under the water. As fresh water made its way to the lake via the waterfall, the black sludge gradually started to thin out on its own.
Ha! So much for sage trial number 1.
Palm grinned. Porum looked over at him, her face pale and her lips tinged blue as she reached up, bringing her hand across his cheek so hard that he felt the simultaneous sting of the fiery friction of her skin against his and the bits of ice that were still stuck to her fingers from the spells that had been cast upon her by the monster. Palm reached up, screeching as he felt the throbbing skin of his cheek underneath his fingertips.
Ouch! What the hell was that for?
Porum could only stare at him, her chest heaving up and down with haggard breaths. The realization had dawned upon her as soon as he started to swim back over to her with that stupid, cocky grin on his face.
You had your eyes on that monster from the start, didn't you?
Porum asked, her voice cracking from a mixture of exhaustion and rage. When he didn't reply right away, she knew she had hit the nail on the head.
You knew Tello had problems with it, and you wanted to test your mettle on it for yourself. That was why you referred to it as a trial, twice now, by my count. You thought that if you could defeat something Tello had defeated, it would give you a leg up in your little quest, right? You knew what to do because of the stories he told you.
Porum didn't have the decency to look ashamed, although his smile did fade a little.
Yeah, something like that.
She looked away, wrapping her arms around herself to try to rub some warmth back into her limbs. Porum sighed, tapping his foot.
What now?
Porum bit her lip, still not able to bring herself to look at him.
Is that really the kind of thinking a sage would have, Porum?
Palem's jaw dropped. Was this a trick question?
Of course.
It was so comical, she almost wanted to laugh, although she didn't have the strength or the lung capacity to actually make one come out. The elder had granted Porum leave to take his first journey on his own, and this had been the result. He hadn't changed at all, hadn't learned anything from that initial argument she had witnessed in the Tower of Prayer the morning of Cecil's coronation.
Maybe you should think a little more about how to use your magic,
Porum hissed.
I thought you wanted to help the people here who might get hurt by the beast, but you just were using your powers to try to one-up your dead mentor.
Finally, Palem's face fell, and Porum glared down at him, drawing herself to her full height despite the shaking in her muscles.
Well?
Porum demanded, and Porum rolled his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest.
Yeah.
About a week after the twins had safely arrived back home in Mysidia, Porum had returned to the Tower of Prayers from the village marketplace, where she conducted her weekly chore of replenishing the tower's supply of curative items and classroom supplies. Handing her packages over to another mage who was preparing the classroom for an upcoming lesson, Porum trudged up the stairs of the tower to her private room. It had only been recently that she and Porum had stopped sharing a bedroom. It had been a month and some odd weeks before they had traveled to Capo together that the big move had taken place. The elder had recognized that they were rapidly approaching the age where the trials of tween dom would soon become a little more embarrassing for each of them in different ways, and both Porum and Porum were quite grateful that he had made the realization before something awkward had actually happened in their remaining time as roommates. But as a result of each of them having their own space for the first time since, well, ever, they found that they had accidentally taken some of each other's stuff, and even now were still barging into each other's rooms to hunt for lost scrolls, books, or clothes. So, it came as no surprise to Porum when she walked into her room to find Porum standing there, riffling through the piles of books on her desk. But when she greeted him offhandedly and received no reply, she paused near her bed, watching with curiosity the way his shoulder blades had seemed to tense up when she entered, like she had caught him in some illicit act. That was when her eyes fell to the book he had open on her desk, a dog-eared, battle-scarred and weather-worn leather book, the pages filled with her lupus scrawl. Porum felt her heart leap into her throat as she realized he was on the very last page of the journal. She couldn't be sure of how far he had read, but she knew exactly what she had written last. She had filled up the remainder of the journal on their voyage back home to Mysidia from Capo, and had not yet purchased a new one. Porum looked up at her, his eyes dark and his cheeks flushed with what Porum could only assume was hurt and embarrassment. As she parted her lips to try to speak, he shook his head, cutting her off.
So? This is what you really think, hey? Porum.
Porum took a step closer, but in tandem, he took a step back away from her, toward the doorway.
That's private. You shouldn't have gone through my stuff like that. I was just looking for my bestiary,
Porum snapped.
It has the same cover as this stupid tattle rag of yours. But I guess that doesn't matter to you, you just immediately jumped to blaming me, like always. Porum.
Porum tried again, not liking the desperation that had started to creep into her tone.
I'm sorry. I write to work through my emotions, it helps ground me so that I can keep a level head for my studies. I don't always mean what I write at the time. It's just a way of getting things off my chest. You don't always mean what you write, but that means sometimes you do, right?
Porum smirked. She saw him fuss with something on his right hand, tossing it to the floor.
If you find my book, just drop it off in front of my door, don't come in unless you want me to fry all the hair off that double-crossing head of yours.
He stormed out, slamming the door behind him so loudly that Porum could swear she felt the entire tower shake. Her eyes watering, she kneeled down to pick up what her brother had roughly tossed away, a sob catching in her throat as she turned it over in her fingers. It was a simple gold-banded ring with a star shape that had plenty of scratches, something that any normal person would dismiss as a piece of junk not even worth melting down for the menial amount of gil it would fetch. The ring had been purchased as part of a set, which Porum and Porum had affectionately dubbed the Twin Stars. In one of their experimentations they had worked on together after the war, they had found a way to fuse identical objects with magical powers, allowing them to enhance the twin cast magic powers they already shared thanks to their childhood bond. The Twin Stars experiment had granted them access to the mysterious Twin Meteor spell, despite neither of them having the magical qualifications on their own to cast such powerful magic. Porum glanced down at her hand, where her own matching ring sat on her ring finger. It was only in slightly better condition than Palem's, but that wasn't saying much. She didn't think either of them had ever taken their rings off since the day they had cast their first successful Twin Meteor spell together. Opening the top drawer of her desk, Porum deposited Palem's ring and picked up the journal. Even though she already knew what it said, she felt the need to twist the knife just a little bit more that had been lodged in her chest by the look in her twin's eyes as he had fled to get as far away from her as fast as possible. My brother has taken things too far. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt with this trip, but I realize now that was extremely foolish, perhaps even naive, on my part. How can I possibly continue to place my faith and trust in him after what happened today? And worse yet, I think the elder has been foolish, as well, for if he had not given in to Palem's begging, I would not have needed to bear witness to such hubris. I still haven't decided if I should tell him about this, or if I should just let Palem hang himself. One thing is for sure. I won't be cleaning up any messes for him any longer. I am done. If our parents could see us now, I wonder what they would say? What Palem doesn't realize is that things are better this way. He wants to believe that our parents are being prevented from seeing us, but it's been long enough that I know now that it's most likely that they simply do not feel like they have a place in our lives anymore, that they don't want to see us. I've seen enough in my short time traveling the world to realize that there are all sorts of people on this planet, people of light, people of darkness, children who hate their parents, parents who don't love their children. Maybe our parents never wanted us in the first place, and our magical powers were just a convenient excuse to exit from our lives. Anyway, I can't help but feel like they would be disappointed in us if they were still around. I can sense that with the elder, his disappointment extends to even me when Palem is raising hell or causing him yet more angst, so why would it not be the same with our parents? Everyone sees Palem and I as a unit, not as two different souls. And as for Palem, how can he possibly love anyone but himself, with the way he acts? The perfect representation of our relationship, as it currently stands, was the battle against the monster in the underground waterway. I stayed in the shadows, supporting him, and he never once even bothered to glance back at me as he was bringing down the world around him. I feel like Palem will destroy anything to get his way, including me. He will never become a sage at this rate, and I will be glad for the day he realizes it, so that I no longer need to support his madness. This journey has filled me with a bleakness I have not felt since the day of the Red Wings massacre, when the Tower of Prayer echoed with screams that reached all the way to my room, and the scent of blood could not be purged from the crystal chamber for days after. Porum watched as a tear dripped down her cheek onto the page, and smashed the journal shut, shoving it into the open drawer on top of Palem's ring and closing it. After straightening the mess Palem had made on her desk, she walked over to her bookshelf and reached up, pulling down the bestiary he had been looking for. She had known where it was the whole time. If only he had asked, she could have pointed him right to it. Crossing the short distance across the hallway from her room to his, she gently knocked on his door, clutching the book to her chest.
Palem, I have your book. Leave it outside,
came a muffled voice from within. Was he crying?
Porum
took a deep breath, closing her eyes.
Come on. Can't we talk about this?
She pushed down on the latch to his door, shoving it open. Porum whirled around, his eyes red like an albino rabbit's as he clenched his teeth, his fist swiping at a wet spot on his cheek before grabbing the rod resting next to his bed and pointing it at Porum's startled form.
I warned you not to come in.
The crystal on the top of his rod began to glow with a warning red, and an overwhelming heatwave rolled into the tiny bedroom.
Porum,
End of chapter.